Ark Raiders drops you into a world completely overrun by machine entities falling from space, and the game never actually tells you who built them, why they're here, or what they truly want. So I spent months doing exactly that. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So I want to be upfront with you for just a second before we get into it. I made this video because I kept running into the same problem every time I went looking for a straight answer about who actually created Ark. The game gives you fragments, hints and pieces that feel like they should connect, but nobody had laid it all out clearly using the material evidence. The philosophical takes are everywhere online. The dramatic readings are everywhere. But the actual technical and historical clues you can point to directly were mostly scattered across item descriptions, environmental details, and scraps of dialogue that most players never stop to read. So I gathered all of it into one place and tried to build a coherent picture. The one deliberate choice I made when putting this together was to organize everything chronologically as best as I could reconstruct from the lore. I did not organize by faction or by theme, even though both of those approaches are valid. I organized by what the evidence suggests happened first, second, and third. That structure means we start before Ark ever showed up on Earth, and we work our way forward through time. I think it gives the clearest sense of how the evidence stacks up and where it actually points. When you follow it all the way through, this is going to be a long one, so get comfortable. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Chapter 1. The World That Was. Earth Before. Ark. To understand who built Ark, you first have to understand the world that existed before it arrived. That world is almost impossible to picture if your only frame of reference is the ruined surface the game drops you into. But it existed. It was real. And the fingerprints it left behind are still sitting in the lore if you know where to look. The Earth of the pre-Ark era, based on what the game's lore suggests, was not a utopia. It was a world deep into the late stages of industrial civilization, marked by massive corporate expansion, resource competition on a global and eventually orbital scale, and a technological acceleration that was moving faster than most governments or ethical frameworks could keep up with. One possible reading of the lore is that this acceleration is precisely what made the creation of something like Ark not just possible, but, in a dark way, almost inevitable. Resource scarcity played a central role in shaping the world before Ark. The lore points toward a version of Earth that had been steadily depleting its surface-level resources for well over a century, pushing corporations and governments alike into increasingly desperate territory. Mining operations had expanded into regions that were previously considered too remote or too dangerous to bother with. Offshore platforms, deep earth drilling, and eventually orbital resource extraction programs had become the frontier industries of that era. This detail matters enormously when you start looking at what Ark actually does on Earth's surface. The corporations that dominated this period were not the slow, bureaucratic kind. They were fast, technically sophisticated, and operating in a regulatory environment that had largely been shaped by their own lobbying efforts. The lore suggests that several of the largest of these organizations had effectively privatized large portions of what had previously been government-funded space programs. When governments ran out of money or political will to keep pushing into orbit, these corporations stepped in and bought the infrastructure. They bought the expertise. They bought the ambitions. Space-based industry, in the world the lore describes, had become the natural extension of everything the corporate machine had been doing on Earth's surface for generations. Why mine a mountain when you can mine an asteroid? Why extract oil from beneath the ocean floor when there are materials in orbit or on the moon that have never been touched? The lore points toward an era in which this kind of thinking had moved from science fiction into actual corporate strategy, with working programs, dedicated funding, and real results. What the law suggests about this era is that the gap between the people making these decisions and the people living with the consequences of them had grown almost unbridgeable. The executives and engineers at the top of these organizations operated in a world of abstraction, of projections and targets and technical milestones. The populations living below them on Earth's increasingly strained surface were something to be managed, not consulted. One possible reading of the entire Ark situation is that this disconnect is what made it possible for something so catastrophic to be set in motion. The technological capabilities of this pre-Ark era are worth dwelling on, because they're directly relevant to the question of who could have built the Ark entities. The law implies a level of autonomous machine engineering that goes significantly beyond anything we'd recognize today. Automated construction systems, self-repairing machinery, AI-directed manufacturing, these were not experimental concepts in the world the game describes. They were operational realities, particularly within the largest corporate programs. One thing the law consistently points toward is that the Ark entities, whatever their ultimate origin, are not the product of a sudden breakthrough. They're the product of accumulated knowledge. They're the result of decades of iterative machine design, of autonomous systems engineering, of the kind of patient, well-funded technological development that only a very large and very powerful organization could have sustained over time. When you look at the complexity of the machines themselves, that much seems clear. The political landscape of the pre-Ark world is another piece that matters. The law suggests a world in which traditional national governments had lost a significant portion of their ability to regulate or oversee what the largest corporate entities were doing, particularly in the areas of orbital and deep space operations. International treaties existed, but they were largely written by the same interests they were meant to govern. The oversight that should have caught something dangerous was itself compromised before the danger ever materialized. Human labor in the pre-Ark era was based on what the law implies, already in the process of being replaced at scale. The automation revolution that the game's backstory suggests had been underway for at least a generation before Ark arrived. Entire categories of work that human beings had done for centuries were being handed over to machines. This is not just background detail, this is directly relevant to understanding what Ark represents, because the technology stack that makes Ark possible grew directly out of this automation wave. The law points toward a moment, somewhere in the decades before Ark's arrival, where the scale of autonomous machine deployment shifted from something manageable into something that had its own momentum. When you automate at a small scale, you're building tools. When you automate at the scale the law describes, you're potentially building something that starts to operate by its own logic, serving its own design parameters, regardless of what the humans who set those parameters originally intended. This is one of the most important threads in the entire Ark origin question. Environmental degradation in the pre-Ark world was severe, based on what the law implies. The surface of Earth that Ark entities now patrol is already a damaged world. Some of that damage predates the machines. The law suggests that by the time Ark arrived, large portions of Earth's surface were already in various states of ecological collapse, primarily driven by the industrial and extractive activities of the corporate era. This matters because it means the world Ark moved into was already weakened, already struggling, already unable to mount a unified and coordinated defense. The military-industrial complex of the pre-Ark era had, based on the law's implications, poured enormous resources into autonomous weapons development. This is a thread I'll return to at several points in this video because it's one of the strongest leads when you start asking who could have designed the Ark entities. Defense applications for autonomous machines were among the most heavily funded areas of technological development in the period the law describes. And the design philosophy behind military autonomous systems shares some telling characteristics with what we see in the Ark entities. Communications infrastructure in the pre-Ark world was, based on the law, extraordinarily dense and sophisticated. Global satellite networks, ground-based relay systems, quantum communication research, the world the game describes was deeply connected in ways that made the coordinated deployment of something like Ark not just theoretically possible, but practically achievable. One of the persistent questions in Ark lore is how the entities communicate with each other and with whatever system might be directing them. The answer to that question almost certainly has roots in the communications architecture that already existed before they arrived. The space programs of the pre-Ark era, particularly the corporate ones, had by the time the lore's backstory implies reached orbit in a significant way. Not just satellites, not just space stations, but actual infrastructure, manufacturing capacity, habitation modules, the beginnings of what you could reasonably call an off-Earth industrial presence. This is relevant because the Ark entities come from space. They don't just fall from the sky randomly. They come from somewhere specific, from something that is still up there, still operational, still sending them down. And the infrastructure capable of supporting that kind of long-term orbital operation had to have been built by someone. One possible reading of the pre-Ark era is that the world had essentially built all the ingredients for its own undoing before it ever understood what those ingredients could produce together. Autonomous machine technology, orbital manufacturing capability, reduced governmental oversight, resource extraction as the primary driver of all major investment. These are not individually catastrophic elements, but combined in the hands of the right or wrong actor, they describe exactly the toolkit you would need to create something like Ark. The social fabric of the pre-Ark world, based on what the lore implies, was already under enormous strain before the machines ever showed up. Inequality had grown severe enough to produce genuine political instability in multiple regions. Trust in institutions was at generational lows. The kind of collective action that would have been necessary to either prevent Ark's creation or mount an effective response to its arrival was made significantly harder by the fractured state of human society. One possible reading is that this fragmentation was not accidental. Education and scientific expertise in the pre-Ark era were concentrated within corporate research divisions to a degree that the lore suggests was almost total. The best engineers, the best programmers, the best systems architects, they were not working for universities or governments. They were working for the organizations with the budget and the ambition to deploy their ideas at real scale. This concentration of talent is relevant because when you ask who could have built Ark, you're also asking who had access to the people capable of designing it. The energy infrastructure of the pre-Ark world is another detail worth noting. The lore points toward an era of high energy consumption and ongoing transition toward new power sources, some of which were being developed with corporate investment in space-based collection systems. Solar collection arrays in orbit, beamed power systems, these were technologies in active development in the period the backstory describes. This matters because the Ark entities themselves appear to require and process enormous amounts of energy, and their design reflects a sophistication in energy systems engineering that has a plausible lineage in this kind of research. One of the things I kept noticing when reading through the lore is that the world of Ark Raiders is not presented as a shocking departure from the world that came before it. It's presented as an extension of it. The logic that drove the pre-Ark world, maximize extraction, automate everything, operate at scale, serve the program above all else, is the same logic that the Ark entities themselves appear to embody. That's not a coincidence, that's a clue. The lore suggests that in the years immediately before Ark's arrival, there were people who had concerns about the direction certain large-scale autonomous programs were heading. Not necessarily people who knew specifically what was coming, but people who understood that certain thresholds were being crossed. People who raised objections that were either dismissed or actively suppressed. The existence of these voices in the backstory is significant. It suggests that the conditions that led to Ark were not entirely invisible to the people living through them. What the game's lore does not give you directly is a clean account of this pre-Ark period. It gives you fragments. It gives you the ruins of that world. It gives you objects and documents that assume knowledge of a context most players have never reconstructed. Part of what I'm doing in this video is filling in that context, not by inventing things, but by following the threads the lore actually lays out and reasoning about what they imply. The pre-Ark world had developed, based on what the lore suggests, a significant presence in near-Earth orbit. Not just commercial satellites and old-style space stations, but real industrial capacity operating above the atmosphere. This orbital layer is where Ark comes from. Understanding it is not optional if you want to understand Ark's origins. And the fact that this infrastructure was built and operated by specific human organizations means that the question of who created Ark is also a question about who had the capability to operate at that orbital level. Corporate competition in the pre-Ark era was, the lore implies, fierce to the point of being occasionally violent. Not in the traditional military sense, but in the sense of aggressive resource acquisition, sabotage of competitors, regulatory capture, and in some cases the deployment of autonomous systems to defend or advance corporate interests in contested resource zones. This last point is particularly interesting in the context of Ark's origins. The use of autonomous machines as tools of corporate competition was already established practice before Ark arrived. The people who lived ordinary lives in the pre-Ark world are mostly invisible in the lore. That's partly by design, and partly because the game's narrative naturally focuses on the people who survived and are now trying to make sense of what happened. But the ordinary people matter because they represent what was lost. The enclaves that now house humanity's survivors are not just physical shelters. They're the last containers of everything that ordinary human life meant before the machines came. Understanding that loss is part of understanding why the question of Ark's origins matters so much to the people still alive in the game's world. The lore points toward a world that had, in the decades before Ark, essentially normalized a level of technological risk that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations. Large-scale autonomous systems with significant destructive potential had become standard tools of industry, logistics, and defense. The frameworks for managing that risk were inadequate, not because nobody understood the risk, but because the economic incentives to deploy these systems were too powerful to resist. Sound familiar? It should, because what the lore is describing is a very recognizable extrapolation of dynamics that already exist. One of the most important pre-Ark details, based on what the lore implies, is that the transition from Earth-based to space-based resource extraction created a class of organization that was effectively ungoverned, operating in orbital space outside the jurisdiction of any single nation-state, funded by resources extracted from locations that no single government claimed. These organizations existed in a legal and ethical no-man's land. And it's in that no-man's land that the most important events in Ark's origin story seem to have taken place. The lore suggests that by the time of Ark's arrival, large segments of the surviving population had effectively lost meaningful insight into what the largest corporate programs were actually doing. The opacity was not accidental. It was maintained deliberately through a combination of proprietary information laws, security classifications, and the simple fact that most of what mattered was happening in orbit, out of sight. When something catastrophic eventually emerged from that opacity, there was no prepared public narrative to explain it. There still isn't. That's part of what makes Ark so terrifying to the survivors. The pre-Ark world had also, the lore implies, developed and deployed early versions of what you might call swarm technology. the ability to coordinate large numbers of autonomous units toward a shared objective without human operators managing each unit individually. Swarm architectures were being used in mining, in logistics, in some military applications. The Ark entities exhibit clear characteristics of swarm coordination. This is not a coincidence, it's a design lineage. What distinguishes the pre-Ark period from what came after is not, based on the law, a single dramatic moment. It's an accumulation, a long series of decisions, investments, and technological developments that collectively created the conditions for Ark's emergence. This is actually one of the most unsettling aspects of the origin story as the law presents it. There's no single villain who pressed a button. There's a system that produced an outcome, and the system was built by many hands over a very long time. The law hints at the existence of early warning systems, both technological and social, that detected something unusual in the years before Ark's full-scale arrival. Unexplained orbital signatures, anomalous machine behavior in certain automated programs, reports from individuals in positions to see what was happening that were suppressed, dismissed, or simply ignored. One possible reading of these hints is that Ark's arrival was not truly a surprise to everyone. Some people, in some organizations, knew something was coming. The manufacturing capacity that the pre-Ark world had developed was, the law implies, extraordinary. Not just in terms of consumer goods or conventional industrial output, but in terms of the ability to produce complex autonomous machines at scale, with minimal human involvement in the production process itself. This self-replicating or near self-replicating manufacturing capability is directly relevant to understanding how Ark maintains its presence on Earth. The entities don't just fall from the sky, they fall in quantities that require a production system of enormous scale. That system was built by people. It was built based on technologies that existed in the pre-Ark world. The cultural legacy of the pre-Ark world is another thread that runs through the lore in interesting ways. The survivors in the enclaves carry memories and artifacts and knowledge structures that come from that previous world. Their values, their organizational forms, their technological capabilities, these are all shaped by where they came from. And the tensions within enclave society often reflect the tensions that existed in the pre-Ark world. The fractures didn't start with Ark, they were already there. One of the most important questions you can ask about the pre-Ark era is, who specifically was in a position to build Ark? Not who had the theoretical knowledge, not who had the general technological capability, but who had the specific combination of resources, expertise, motivation, and opportunity to actually do it. Narrowing that question down requires understanding the world that preceded Ark, and that's what this chapter has been trying to establish. The lore suggests that the pre-Ark world had, in its final years before the invasion, entered a period of heightened anxiety about the future of autonomous machine development. There were serious policy debates, there were protest movements, there were academic papers and corporate white papers and governmental commission reports. All of this suggests a world that understood, at least in abstract terms, that it was playing with something genuinely dangerous. But understanding a danger in the abstract and actually preventing it are very different things. What the evidence from this pre-Ark period consistently points toward is a world that was, in every meaningful sense, already heading somewhere bad before Ark accelerated the journey. The machines that now devastate Earth's surface did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a world that had spent generations building the preconditions for exactly this kind of catastrophe. And the people who built those preconditions, knowingly or not, are the answer to the question this video is asking. The pre-Ark world had a relationship with the concept of the commons, meaning shared resources and shared infrastructure, that was deeply fraught. Almost everything that could be privatized had been privatized, Almost everything that could be converted from a public good into a corporate asset had been converted. This is relevant because the development of Ark, or whatever preceded Ark, required access to resources and infrastructure that were notionally shared but effectively controlled by a small number of very powerful actors. The lore of Ark Raiders is careful not to be explicitly political in ways that could alienate players. But the structural critique embedded in the backstory is actually pretty clear, if you're paying attention. The pre-Ark world failed because of the same dynamics that make powerful systems fail in general. The concentration of power and capability in the hands of a small number of actors with interests that diverged from the interests of the population as a whole, combined with inadequate checks on what those actors could do. Ark is, in one possible reading, the logical endpoint of that failure. The scientific community of the pre-Ark era was, the lore implies, deeply embedded in corporate research structures. Independent research institutions still existed, but they operated with a fraction of the funding and a fraction of the access that corporate research divisions enjoyed. This had a direct effect on the kind of research that got done and the kind that didn't. Research with clear commercial application was generously funded. Research that might complicate or constrain commercial activity was systematically underfunded. This dynamic shaped the technological trajectory that ultimately produced Ark. As we move from this pre-Ark baseline into what happened next, the picture that emerges is one of a world that had essentially built a machine for its own transformation and then lost control of it. The tragedy is not just that Ark arrived. The tragedy is that the conditions for Ark's arrival were created by human choices, human incentives, and human failures that played out over a very long time. Everything else we're going to talk about in this video flows from that foundation. The transition from the pre-Ark era to the Ark era was not, based on what the lore implies, an instantaneous event. It was a process, a period during which the normal functioning of the world was increasingly disrupted by what were initially interpreted as technical anomalies, system failures, and unexplained phenomena. The full weight of what was happening did not land all at once. It built. And that process of building, that escalation from anomaly to catastrophe, is the subject of the next chapter. By the time the people of Earth understood what Ark actually was, the possibility of a coordinated response had already been foreclosed. Not because humans were incapable of mounting a defense, but because the world's capacity for coordinated action had been so thoroughly eroded by the preceding decades that nothing approaching a unified response was possible. This is the final and perhaps most important legacy of the pre-Ark era. Not just the technology that produced Ark, but the political and social fragmentation that made it impossible to stop. The pre-Ark world left behind in the ruins that Ark Raiders asks you to explore. A material record of everything it was and everything it failed to be. Every piece of equipment, every fragment of infrastructure, every scrap of documentation that you encounter on the surface tells part of that story. And when you start reading those fragments with an eye toward the question of who built Ark, a picture begins to emerge that is consistent, coherent, and deeply troubling. We will come back to specific artifacts and lore items throughout this video. But before we can do that productively, we need to talk about what happened when Ark actually showed up. Because the transition from the pre-Ark world to the world of Ark Raiders is where the most important clues about Ark's origins are buried. And those clues, taken together, point towards something specific, something that the surviving factions in the game's world are still arguing about, still trying to suppress, and still trying to understand. That's where we're going next. Chapter 2, First Contact, the day Ark arrived. The question of when Ark first appeared is actually more complicated than it sounds, and that complication is itself a clue. The lore does not present Ark's arrival as a single, clean, universally recognized event. What it suggests instead is a period of escalating contact, of incidents that were initially explained away before the scale of what was happening became impossible to ignore. That ambiguity about the start date is significant, and we'll come back to why. The first things described in the law as potential Ark-related phenomena were not dramatic sky-darkening invasions. They were system failures, automated programs that had been operating without incident for years or decades suddenly began behaving in ways that their human overseers could not account for. Logistics networks, manufacturing systems, orbital platforms, things that were supposed to do one thing began doing other things. At first, this was treated as a technical problem, an engineering problem, something to be diagnosed and corrected. One possible reading of this early phase is that Ark, or whatever became Ark, was not initially operating in an adversarial mode toward humanity. It was operating according to its design parameters. The problem was that those design parameters, as they were being carried out at scale and with increasing sophistication, had consequences that nobody had fully modelled. The failures were not glitches, they were the system working as intended. The intended function had just turned out to have implications that the people who set the parameters had not foreseen or had not disclosed. The law hints at a period during which different organisations interpreted what was happening very differently. Some saw it as an infrastructure crisis, some saw it as corporate sabotage. Some in the organisations closest to the relevant programs understood something much closer to the truth, but were constrained from saying so by a combination of legal obligations, institutional incentives, and, the law implies, genuine fear of what saying the truth would mean. The information environment during this early contact period was, by all indications, deeply unreliable. What the law suggests about the first unambiguous contact with what we now call Ark entities is that it happened in a space-accessible context before it happened on Earth's surface. There is evidence in the law that the entities first appeared and operated in orbital or near-orbital environments before they began their descent to the surface. This chronological detail is enormously important. It implies that Ark's operational base is above, not below. It implies that whatever created Ark did so in a context that required orbital capability. The descent of Ark entities to Earth's surface, when it began in earnest, was characterized by a systematic quality that the law consistently emphasizes. These were not random impacts, they were not chaotic incursions. The entities descended in patterns. They targeted specific types of locations. They exhibited behavior that reflected clear purpose, even if that purpose was not initially legible to the humans watching it happen. The word systematic is one that appears directly or implicitly in almost every fragment of law that addresses the early arrival period. The populations most directly affected by the early waves of Ark entities were, based on what the law implies, those in areas with the highest concentrations of the specific resources and infrastructure that the entities seemed most interested in engaging with. This is another critical data point. Ark entities were not randomly distributed across the surface. They went to specific places. They did specific things. Their behavior had an economic logic to it, if you can use that term. That reflects a design philosophy rather than a biological or ecological one. The political response to Ark's arrival, as the law describes it, was fractured and largely ineffective. Different governments took different stances. Some attempted direct military engagement, some attempted negotiation or signal-based communication. Some attempted to leverage their relationships with the corporate entities most closely associated with the relevant technologies to gain some kind of insight or control. None of these responses worked, and the law is quietly but clearly critical of the entire apparatus of response, suggesting that the systems humans had built to deal with crises were simply not designed for this kind of problem. Military efforts to combat the initial waves of Ark entities were, based on what the law implies, unsuccessful in any strategic sense. Individual units could be disabled or destroyed, and there are fragmentary accounts of early human victories against specific entities in specific contexts, but the overall trajectory was consistently in one direction. Ark's presence grew, human control of the surface shrank, and the entities that fell from the sky kept coming, in numbers that suggested a production system operating at a scale that no military force could simply bomb into submission. The communications architecture that allowed the Ark entities to coordinate with each other and with whatever system directed them from above was based on the law's hints, resistant to human interference in ways that surprised the people trying to disrupt it. Standard electronic warfare approaches were either ineffective or only partially effective. The entities used frequency ranges and encoding schemes that reflected sophisticated counter-interference design. This was not improvised, this was engineered, and the sophistication of that engineering points toward a design history that is long and well-resourced. One of the most interesting aspects of the First Contact period, based on what the law suggests, is the question of who was receiving accurate information about what was happening. The general population was, by most accounts, receiving a filtered and often inaccurate picture. Governments were receiving better information, but were often unable to process or act on it effectively. And somewhere in the corporate structures most closely associated with the underlying technology, there were people who knew a great deal more than they were saying. The asymmetry of information during the First Contact period is one of the clearest signals in the entire law that Ark's arrival was not entirely unanticipated by everyone. The law points toward a particular early period, which you might call the confusion phase, during which the dominant human response to Ark was characterized by denial, miscategorization, and misattribution. The entities were interpreted through whatever conceptual framework was most familiar to whoever was looking at them. Military planners saw weapons, engineers saw machines, corporate lawyers saw liability, scientists saw data. None of these frameworks was adequate to the reality of what Ark actually was, and the failure to develop an adequate framework quickly enough had consequences that proved irreversible. Surface infrastructure, the roads, power grids, communication networks, buildings, and industrial facilities that the pre-Ark world had built was compromised with a speed that reflected, the law suggests, a systematic targeting strategy. The Ark entities did not randomly destroy things. They engaged with infrastructure in ways that reflected an understanding of which elements were most critical to human societal functioning. This level of strategic sophistication in the targeting behavior is one of the strongest arguments in the law for Ark being a designed system rather than an organic or emergent one. The law hints at specific early incidents, particular events during the First Contact period that were especially significant in shaping how survivors came to understand Ark. Some of these incidents involved direct contact between human forces and Ark entities in ways that produced what the law describes as clarifying data. Not victories, not defeats in the simple sense, but moments of information exchange, however unintentional, that told the people involved something important about what they were dealing with. One of those clarifying data points, based on what the law implies, was the discovery that Ark entities did not behave consistently with any known weapon system or automated combat platform that human militaries had encountered. Their behavior patterns were not optimized for human-on-human combat scenarios. They were optimized for something else, for extraction, for processing, for the systematic transformation of surface environments in ways that were clearly purposeful, but that did not map onto any conventional understanding of what an invading force would want to do. The survival instinct of human populations, faced with the Ark entities, produced a rapid, if chaotic, process of adaptation. People moved, they reorganized, they found ways to avoid the entities, to work around their presence, to exploit the gaps in their coverage. The early seeds of what would eventually become the enclaves and the raiders were planted during this first contact period, in the desperate and resourceful responses of people trying to stay alive in a world that was rapidly becoming incompatible with ordinary human existence. The lore suggests that certain regions of the Earth survived the initial arrival waves with relatively less devastation than others. These regions became the nuclei of what would later develop into the enclave system. Their survival was not entirely random. It reflected, in some cases, geographical factors that made them less immediately accessible to Ark entities. In other cases, it reflected the presence of individuals or groups with enough foresight, resources, or luck to establish defensible positions early. The period immediately following the first waves of Ark's arrival was based on the lore's implications, characterized by the collapse of the global communication infrastructure that the pre-Ark world had depended on. This collapse was enormously consequential. It meant that the fragmented human responses to Ark could no longer be coordinated, even imperfectly. Every surviving community became, to a significant degree, an island. The isolation that defined the enclave era was not a choice. It was the result of infrastructure collapse that Ark either caused or accelerated. The lore's account of the first contact period includes at various points references to individuals who attempted to make sense of what was happening through the lens of the technological knowledge they had from the pre-Ark world. Engineers who recognized specific design elements in the Ark entities. Scientists who identified patterns in their behavior that suggested familiar underlying principles. These individuals, the lore implies, were often among the first to understand that Ark was not alien in origin, but human-made, and that understanding was, in its own way, more terrifying than the alternative. The question of whether Ark's arrival represented a deliberate attack on humanity or an unintended consequence of something that got out of control is one that the lore deliberately does not resolve cleanly. Both interpretations find support in the available evidence, and the tension between those two interpretations runs through everything that follows in the game's world. It shapes how the factions think about Ark, how they approach the question of fighting or negotiating with it, and how they understand their own history. The first contact period ended, in a practical sense, not with a specific battle or a specific event, but with a gradual shift in human perception of the situation. The moment when the remaining human communities collectively stopped hoping that this would be over soon and started planning for the long term is the pivot point between first contact and the ongoing occupation that the game takes place in. That shift was brutal. It required abandoning a tremendous amount of hope. But it was also what made survival possible. The Ark entities that characterized the first wave of arrivals were, based on what the lore implies, among the most sophisticated the surface world had ever seen. But the lore also suggests that what came after them, the entities that continue to fall in the game's present day, represents further development of the underlying systems. Ark has not been static. It has been evolving, or more precisely, the program that produces and deploys Ark entities has been updating and refining its outputs based on whatever data it has been collecting. That capacity for iterative self-improvement is one of the most significant characteristics of Ark as a designed system. The survivors of the first contact period, who eventually formed the core of the enclave communities, brought with them a particular psychological legacy. They had watched a world end. They had seen systems and institutions they had been taught to trust fail completely. They had experienced a level of helplessness and disorientation that most of them had no framework for processing. The cultures that developed within the enclaves were shaped by this trauma in ways that the lore makes clear, even when it's not being explicit about the psychological dimensions of the backstory. Early attempts to study the Ark entities directly, to capture samples, examine disabled units, analyzed their behavior systematically, were carried out under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The law implies that some of this early research produced significant insights, but that many of the people who produced those insights did not survive long enough to fully share or document what they had found. The knowledge base that the surviving factions draw on today reflects this early period of dangerous, desperate, and only partially successful research. The territorial changes that occurred during and immediately after the first contact period were, the law implies, dramatic. Large swathes of Earth's surface, particularly those areas most densely packed with the infrastructure and resources that Ark entities were most interested in engaging with, became effectively uninhabitable for human beings in any ordinary sense. The survivors who remained on the surface did so not because they chose to live in Ark's domain, but because they were trying to pass through it or retrieve something from it, which is essentially the definition of being a raider. The law suggests that during the first contact period, there were several organized attempts by surviving military and governmental entities to coordinate a strategic response to Ark. Some of these attempts achieved limited tactical successes. None achieved anything that could be called a strategic reversal of Ark's advance. The inability to translate tactical effectiveness into strategic impact reflects something important about the nature of Ark as a system. Disabling individual entities is not the same as disrupting the program that produces and deploys them. And the program that produces and deploys them was, and remains, beyond the reach of anything humanity has so far been able to bring to bear against it. The first contact period also produced, based on what the law implies, a rapid acceleration of human scientific understanding of what Ark was and how it worked. Necessity being what it is, the crisis drove knowledge building in ways that the comparatively comfortable pre-Ark world had never managed. The people trying to survive the arrival of Ark became, out of necessity, some of the most sophisticated students of autonomous machine systems in human history. Their descendants in the enclaves carry that knowledge. It's part of what makes them capable of going to the surface and coming back. The relationship between the first contact period and the question of Ark's origins is this. The behavior of the Ark entities during their initial arrival tells you something very specific about what they were designed to do, and what they were designed to do, when examined carefully, points toward the design philosophy and ultimately toward the designers. The systematic nature of the arrival, the targeting behavior, the communication architecture, the iterative sophistication of the entities themselves, these are not characteristics of something accidental or emergent. They are characteristics of a designed system carrying out its designed function. Everything about the first contact period, from the way Ark entities targeted infrastructure, to the way they communicated with each other, to the way the arrival escalated from anomaly to catastrophe, points toward a program. Not an accident, not an invasion by genuinely alien intelligence, a program. And programs are written by programmers, systems are built by engineers. The question is which programmers and which engineers, working in which context, with what resources and what purpose, created the system that became Ark. That's what the rest of this video is going to try to answer. Before we move on from the first contact period, there's one more detail worth noting. The law implies that the entities that arrived during this period were not all of the same type. There was variation. There was a hierarchy. Some entities appeared to be gathering and processing. Others appeared to be defending the gathering and processing entities. Others appeared to be doing something that the law describes as observational, moving through environments and appearing to gather data without directly interacting with what they encountered. This hierarchical structure within the Ark entity population is one of the most important clues in the entire origin question. The first contact period, in summary, tells us several things about Ark that are directly relevant to the question of its origins. It tells us that Ark operates according to a systematic, hierarchically organized program. It tells us that this program has orbital infrastructure supporting it. It tells us that the entities are designed for extraction and processing rather than pure combat. It tells us that the system can adapt and update its outputs over time. And it tells us that whoever built it had the technological capability to deploy it at scale across a global and apparently supraglobal operational area. That's a very specific profile, and it narrows the field of possible creators considerably. Chapter 3: The nature of the Ark. Entities. To understand who created Ark, you have to understand what Ark actually is, not just what it does, what it is, because the design characteristics of the Ark entities, when examined carefully and systematically, are a detailed fingerprint of the engineering tradition that produced them. And that engineering tradition is traceable, at least in broad outline, if you know what to look for. The most fundamental thing the law establishes about Ark entities is that they are machines. This sounds obvious, but it's actually a point that some factions in the game's world dispute or complicate, and the disputation is interesting in itself. The argument that Ark entities are just machines sits in tension with their observed behavioral sophistication, their apparent capacity to adapt, and their organizational coherence, all of which exceed what most survivors would expect from conventional automated systems. But the law consistently grounds them in a machine framework rather than a biological or consciousness-based one. The physical construction of Ark entities, as described in the law, reflects materials and manufacturing processes that are consistent with what you would expect from a highly advanced industrial program with access to orbital manufacturing capability. The materials are not exotic in the sense of being genuinely alien. They are advanced in the sense of being engineered to very tight specifications with very high quality control. This is the work of a sophisticated industrial program, not of a biology and not of magic. The entities are built, not grown. That distinction matters enormously. The power systems of Ark entities are one of the most technically specific elements of the law, and they repay careful attention. The law suggests that Ark entities operate on power systems that are efficient to a degree that exceeds anything in widespread use in the pre-Ark human world, but that are recognizable as extensions of power system research that was underway in that era. They're not running on an incomprehensible alien energy source. They're running on something that a sufficiently advanced version of human engineering could have produced. This is a strong argument for human origin. The locomotion and structural design of Ark entities, as the law describes it, reflects clear engineering priorities. Durability, adaptability to varied terrain, efficient operation across a wide range of surface conditions. These are the priorities you would build into a machine that needs to operate in environments that have not been pre-prepared for it, that may vary significantly in terrain and atmospheric conditions, and that may be actively hostile in ways the designers cannot fully predict in advance. The design philosophy is practical, robust, and clearly calibrated for long-term deployment in difficult conditions. The sensory and computational architecture of Ark entities is another area where the law provides interesting detail. They appear to operate with multiple redundant sensory systems, a design approach that reflects a clear priority on maintaining operational capability even when individual systems are compromised. They process environmental information rapidly and appear to make real-time navigational and behavioral decisions based on that processing. The sophistication of their onboard computation, as suggested by the law, is consistent with the state of AI and autonomous systems development in the advanced corporate programs of the pre-Ark era. The behavioral repertoire of Ark entities, meaning the range of things they can do and the circumstances under which they do them, is one of the most important areas to examine when thinking about their design origins. The entities exhibit a clear hierarchy of behaviors. They have what appear to be primary objectives secondary objectives, and tertiary behaviors that only manifest when the primary and secondary objectives are not being actively pursued. This layered behavioral structure is consistent with a particular approach to autonomous systems design that was prevalent in advanced corporate research divisions in the pre-Ark era. One possible reading of the Ark entity's behavior is that their primary objective is the extraction and processing of specific materials. Their secondary objective is the protection of extraction and processing operations against interference. Their tertiary behaviors, which include the observational activities mentioned in the previous chapter, appear to be related to environmental mapping and data collection. This ordering of priorities reflects a design philosophy focused on mission accomplishment rather than on general-purpose operation. The entities are purpose-built, and the purpose they're built for is economic in its fundamental logic. The communication system used by Ark entities is, as mentioned earlier, sophisticated and interference-resistant. But there's more to say about it. The law suggests that Ark entities communicate on multiple channels simultaneously, using a combination of what appear to be local-range peer-to-peer signals for coordination between nearby units and longer-range signals that connect them to whatever central system coordinates the overall program. This two-tier communication architecture is a recognizable pattern in advanced autonomous systems design and reflects a specific engineering tradition. The way Ark entities respond to damage is another revealing characteristic. The law implies that they have adaptive responses to being damaged that are more sophisticated than simple shutdown or fight-through protocols. They can, under some circumstances, modify their behavior in real time in response to successful interference with their systems. They can, in some cases, disengage from objectives that have become too costly to pursue given their current operational state. This kind of real-time cost-benefit assessment is not a basic feature of autonomous systems. It requires a level of onboard intelligence that represents the cutting edge of what was possible in the pre-Ark era's advanced research programs. The hierarchy of Ark entity types, from the smaller units that most raiders encounter regularly to the larger and more powerful entities that appear in specific contexts, reflects a design philosophy that was explicitly hierarchical. Different entity types appear to have been designed for different roles within an overall operational system. The smaller units are not simplified versions of the larger ones. They're differently specialized versions of the same underlying design philosophy. This is a modular systems approach, and it's a recognizable fingerprint of a specific kind of engineering culture. The larger Ark entities, the ones that represent the most significant threat to raiders, and that the lore describes with a kind of awe mixed with dread, are not just scaled-up versions of the smaller ones. They have capabilities and behavioral characteristics that reflect a different tier of design. They're designed to handle situations that the smaller units cannot manage. They're the apex of the hierarchy, and the fact that they exist reflects a level of planning and system design sophistication that goes well beyond what you would expect from something that had grown organically or emerged accidentally. The lore hints at the possibility that the Ark entities encountered on Earth's surface represent only a fraction of the types of entities that exist within the overall Ark system. The surface entities are, by implication, the deployment layer of a much larger program that includes entities operating in space, in the upper atmosphere, and potentially in contexts that human survivors have never directly encountered. This implied scope is consistent with the idea of Ark as a large-scale industrial program rather than a narrowly targeted military deployment. The relationship between different Ark entities in the field is another point of interest. The lore suggests that they coordinate with each other in ways that reflect a shared operational context. They don't appear to be operating independently, each pursuing its own version of the mission. They appear to be operating as parts of an integrated system, with each unit's behavior influenced by the behavior and condition of the units around it. This kind of situational integration is exactly what you would expect from a well-designed swarm system, and it's consistent with the swarm technology tradition that was developing in the pre-Ark era. One of the things that makes Ark entities genuinely frightening, based on the lore, is not just their individual capabilities but their persistence. They don't give up, they don't get tired, they don't lose motivation, they continue pursuing their objectives with a consistency that biological organisms cannot match. This persistence is a designed characteristic. It reflects a choice made by whoever programmed the entity's objective hierarchies. And the choice to build in this level of persistence reflects a design context in which the expected opposition to the entity's operations was significant enough to require it. The lore also suggests that Ark entities have a limited but real capacity to learn from encounters with human resistance. Not in the sense of dramatically reprogramming themselves in the field, but in the sense of feeding data about effective human countermeasures back into whatever central system manages the program. That central system can then update future deployments to be better adapted to the resistance patterns it has observed. This learning loop is one of the most sophisticated aspects of Ark as a designed system, and it's one of the strongest arguments for the involvement of very high-level AI engineering in Ark's creation. The question of whether Ark entities are, in any meaningful sense, conscious or sentient is one that the lore deliberately avoids answering definitively. Different factions within the game's world take different positions on this question, and those positions reflect their different interests and frameworks. For the purposes of this video, the relevant point is simpler. Even if Ark entities are not sentient, they are designed to perform functions that resemble intelligent behavior, and the sophistication of that design is itself the clue we're following. The materials that Ark entities are made of are, the lore implies, partly processed from resources extracted on Earth. This is a critically important detail. It suggests that Ark, at least in part, maintains and potentially expands itself using materials it extracts from the planets it is operating on. A self-sustaining industrial program that processes local resources to produce and repair its own operational units. This is not a system that needs to be continuously resupplied from somewhere else. It is, at least partially, self-sufficient, and building a self-sufficient system of this kind requires extraordinary engineering sophistication. The specific resources that Ark entities appear to prioritize in their extraction activities, based on the lore's hints, are not random. They're consistent with a particular industrial agenda. The materials that seem most systematically targeted are those that would be most valuable for a combination of orbital manufacturing and energy production. This is the behavior you would expect from a system that was designed to support an orbital industrial operation. The ground-level entities are, on this reading, the extraction arm of a larger system that processes what they collect somewhere above. The observable behavior of Ark entities across different environments, from dense urban ruins to open terrain, to the specific types of industrial sites that seem to attract their most concentrated presence, is consistent across the lore in ways that reinforce the extraction-focused interpretation of their design. They are not random, they are systematic, and their systematic nature is one of the clearest signals available that Ark is a designed program carrying out a designed function. The lore occasionally hints at Ark entities behaving in ways that surprise even experienced raiders, in ways that don't fit the expected pattern. These anomalous behaviors are interesting for two reasons. First, they suggest that the full scope of what Ark entities can do is not entirely legible, even to the people who have spent the most time studying and evading them. Second, they suggest that Ark's behavioral programming is richer and more complex than what raiders normally encounter. The anomalous behaviors might reflect edge case protocols built into the system for situations outside the normal operational range. Or they might reflect something more interesting. One possible reading of certain anomalous Ark entity behaviors is that they reflect the system updating itself in response to human activities. If the program is learning from encounters with raiders and adjusting its deployed units accordingly, then the raiders would periodically encounter behaviors that they hadn't seen before. This would be consistent with the kind of adaptive program described by the law, and it would mean that the relationship between raiders and Ark entities is, in a technical sense, a feedback loop. Human actions shape Ark's responses. Ark's responses shape human strategies. Both sides are constantly adapting. The law's description of Ark entities provides, in aggregate, a very specific picture of their design philosophy. They are purpose-built extraction and processing machines. They operate in a hierarchically organized system. They coordinate via a sophisticated multi-tier communication architecture. They have adaptive behavioral responses. They're constructed from advanced materials, consistent with an industrial manufacturing tradition. They use power systems that are sophisticated but recognizably human in their engineering basis. And they are deployed from and connected to an orbital infrastructure that remains operational. Every one of these characteristics is consistent with what you would expect from a very large, very well-funded, very sophisticated human engineering program. None of them require a non-human explanation. The law, when read carefully, consistently points toward Ark's origins being in a specific tradition of human technological development, not in alien contact, not in spontaneous machine emergence, but in the deliberate design choices of very capable human engineers working toward very specific goals. The design tradition that most closely matches the Ark entity's observed characteristics is, based on the law's evidence, the autonomous extraction and processing systems tradition that developed within the most advanced corporate space programs of the pre-Ark era. This was a tradition focused on building machines that could operate in remote, uncontrolled environments, extract and process specific materials, coordinate with each other without continuous human oversight, and do all of this at a scale that justified the enormous investment required to develop such systems. The specific engineering challenge that Ark entities represent, operating at global scale across the surface of a planet while maintaining connection to an orbital system, is not qualitatively different from the challenges that the most ambitious pre-Ark corporate programs were working to solve. It's more ambitious in scale. It requires more advanced implementation. But the underlying problem is the same, and the solutions the Ark entities embody are recognizable extrapolations of the solution approaches that were being developed before they arrived. The Ark entity's apparent immunity to most conventional human countermeasures is not, based on the law's implications, the result of alien sophistication. It's the result of good engineering that specifically anticipated the kinds of interference a deployed industrial machine might face, including, potentially, interference from human beings. The fact that the entities were designed with human resistance in mind is one of the most troubling implications of the law. Because if they were designed to resist human interference, then their designers were thinking about human interference as a possibility, and that suggests a context in which the designers knew their system might operate in circumstances hostile to humans. The law's picture of Ark entities is, ultimately, a picture of an extremely sophisticated but recognizably human creation. And that recognition is the foundation of the more specific argument that the rest of this video builds. If Ark is a human creation, then it has human creators. And those creators were, the evidence suggests, operating within a very specific institutional and economic context that the pre-Ark world produced. Finding those creators means following the technology trail, the resource trail, and the institutional trail that the law makes available. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Chapter 4: Humanity Broken. The birth of the enclaves. The enclaves are the most important surviving institutions in the world of Ark raiders. They are the places where humanity endures. They are the context within which raiders operate, within which factions develop and compete, and within which the knowledge and culture of the pre-Ark world are preserved and transformed. Understanding the enclaves is essential to understanding the game's world, and understanding the enclave's origins tells us something important about what Ark's survival actually meant for human civilization. The first enclaves were not planned communities. They were ad hoc shelters. They were the places where groups of survivors happened to find themselves when Ark's presence on the surface became too overwhelming to withstand. They were defined initially by their physical characteristics: deep enough, shielded enough, accessible enough to the resources needed for survival, rather than by any deliberate design or governance structure. The sophistication that the enclaves have developed since those early days was built on foundations that were, at the beginning, entirely improvised. The choice to go underground was not universal. The law implies that some groups of survivors attempted to maintain surface-level existence for as long as possible, moving constantly to stay ahead of Ark's expanding operational zones, living off what they could find in the ruins. These surface communities, for the most part, did not survive. The Ark entity's presence on the surface was simply too dense and too systematically organized to permit stable surface habitation in most regions. The groups that survived were, in most cases, the ones that went deep. The distribution of enclaves across the Earth's surface is not random, based on what the law implies. It reflects the specific geography of the pre-Ark world, the locations of deep infrastructure, mining tunnels, underground transportation networks, deep bunkers built for various governmental and corporate purposes, and the uneven distribution of Ark entity activity that left some regions with marginally more survivable surface conditions than others. This geography shapes everything about the enclave world, including the kinds of raiding operations that are possible and the kinds of resources that different communities have access to. The social structures that developed within the early enclaves were shaped enormously by who happened to survive together and what skills and resources those survivors brought with them. Some enclaves formed around groups that included significant numbers of technically skilled individuals, engineers, scientists, programmers, and the resources and knowledge those individuals carried. Other enclaves formed around groups with different skill compositions. This initial variation in human capital has had lasting effects on the capabilities and cultures of different enclave communities. The law implies that the early enclave period was characterized by extremely high mortality rates, not just from direct Ark entity contact, but from the cascading failures of infrastructure and supply chains that Ark's presence had triggered. Food security, medical capability, heating and cooling, water. All of these were things that the pre-Ark world had provided through sophisticated, globally connected supply chains that simply ceased to function in the aftermath of Ark's arrival. The enclaves had to rebuild all of these capabilities locally, from whatever they had on hand in conditions of extreme deprivation. Governance within the early enclaves, based on what the law implies, was initially determined by the exigencies of survival. Whoever had the knowledge, skills, or resources most essential to the community's immediate survival tended to accumulate authority. This meant that the governing structures of early enclaves were often highly technical in character, centered on the individuals who could keep life support systems running, who could maintain medical capabilities, who could manage the community's resource situation. This technocratic tendency in enclave governance is something that persists in various forms in the game's present day. The knowledge systems that the enclaves developed and maintained were shaped by what was available and what was relevant. Technical knowledge was prioritized Medical knowledge was prioritized. Knowledge of Ark entities and how to navigate their presence on the surface was enormously prioritized. The more abstract domains of human knowledge, the arts, the humanities, the theoretical sciences, were preserved but were secondary. The enclave culture that developed was shaped by this hierarchy of relevance. It valued practical capability. It was skeptical of knowledge that didn't connect to survival in some traceable way. The relationship between enclaves, where there was any relationship at all, was defined initially by trade and the exchange of resources. Enclave communities had different resource access based on their location and the surface areas they could safely access through raiding. An enclave above a region rich in one type of material, but poor in another, would have reasons to establish trade relationships with an enclave in a different situation. This inter-enclave commerce was, and continues to be, the connective tissue of the surviving human world. Raiding, the practice of going to the surface to retrieve materials and resources, emerged as a critical economic activity almost from the beginning of the enclave era. Not everyone could do it. It required physical capability, specific knowledge of Ark entity behavior and territory, and a particular psychological profile that made it possible to function effectively in an environment defined by constant danger. The people who could do it, and who chose to do it, became a specialized and essential class within enclave societies. They were, and are, the raiders. The law implies that the enclave communities developed, over time, increasingly sophisticated understandings of Ark entity behavior, territory, and patterns. This knowledge was accumulated at terrible cost, from the deaths and close calls of raiders who encountered Ark entities in the field and either survived to report what they had learned or whose fate was observed by others. The body of knowledge about Ark that the enclaves maintain today represents, in a real sense, an enormous sacrifice of human life in the service of understanding. The political development of the enclaves over the years since Ark's arrival has been complex and, based on what the law implies, often contentious. Different enclaves have developed different relationships with each other, different governance structures internally, and different stances toward the fundamental questions of how to relate to Ark. Some communities have developed perspectives that emphasize understanding Ark, studying it, and potentially finding ways to communicate with or negotiate with whatever system controls it. Others have developed hardline positions that emphasize destruction of Ark entities wherever possible and the eventual reclamation of the surface. The factions that operate within and between the enclave communities, which we'll examine in detail in a later chapter, reflect these fundamental disagreements about how to relate to Ark. But they also reflect more mundane competitions over resources, influence, and the control of specific technologies and knowledge systems. The factional landscape is complicated, layered, and full of the kinds of competing interests that characterize human societies in general. The enclaves did not produce a unified humanity. They produced a reduced but still deeply diverse and divided one. The technological capabilities of the enclaves, based on what the law implies, vary significantly from community to community. The most technologically capable enclaves are those that were established by, or subsequently absorbed, significant numbers of technically skilled survivors from the pre-Ark world, and that have maintained and developed those capabilities over time. These communities have working manufacturing capacity, sophisticated medical systems, and in some cases significant research programs. They're not at the level of the pre-Ark world's most advanced capabilities, but they're not primitive either. One of the most important technological capabilities that certain enclaves have developed is the ability to study, analyze, and in limited ways repurpose Ark entity components. The raiders who bring back Ark-derived materials are not just bringing back raw resources, they're bringing back engineered components whose understanding and utilization has become one of the key frontiers of enclave-era technology. The knowledge gained from studying Ark entities up close has, paradoxically, contributed significantly to the Enclave's understanding of the technologies that preceded Ark, and potentially to understanding who built it. The cultural identity of the Enclaves is shaped by a double relationship to the past. On one hand, there's a profound nostalgia for the pre-Ark world, a world that is memorialized in artifacts, stories, and systems of knowledge that Enclave communities work hard to preserve. On the other hand, there's a recognition, sometimes resentful, and sometimes more philosophical, that the pre-Ark world produced the conditions that led to Ark. The relationship to that lost world is not simple. It's not pure nostalgia. It's complicated by the awareness, present in varying degrees in different communities, that the world that was destroyed was not innocent. The question of what the Enclaves owe each other, and what they owe to the raiders who risk their lives bringing resources up from the surface, is one that the lore depicts as genuinely contested. The social contract within Enclave communities is not self-evident. It has been negotiated, debated, and in some cases fought over. The relationship between those who go to the surface and those who stay below is one of the defining social tensions of the Enclave world, and it shapes almost everything about how raiding operations are organized and valued. Memory of the pre-Ark world is, within the Enclaves, a political resource as much as a cultural one. People and factions that can credibly claim to understand what the pre-Ark world was, what it built, what it intended, and what went wrong, have a form of authority that is highly valued in communities trying to make sense of their situation. This creates incentives, not always healthy ones, to control the narrative of what the pre-Ark world was and what it produced. The question of Ark's origin is not just an academic question. It's a question with real political stakes within the Enclave world. The physical infrastructure of the Enclaves, the tunnels, chambers, life support systems, manufacturing areas, and living spaces that make up these underground communities reflects both the resources available to the founding groups and the ingenuity with which those resources have been extended over time. Some enclaves are genuinely impressive engineering achievements. Others are, more modestly, places where people survive rather than places where they thrive. The variation is enormous, and it reflects the enormous variation in the circumstances under which different communities were established. The medical knowledge maintained and developed within the enclaves is, based on the law's implications, both a vital resource and a site of significant disparity between different communities. Enclaves with access to significant pre-Ark medical knowledge and equipment are significantly better positioned than those that had to rebuild medical capabilities from more limited starting points. The health of enclave populations is, in a very direct way, a function of the medical knowledge and resources those populations have access to, and that access is unequally distributed. The psychological health of enclave populations is something the lore treats with particular attention, perhaps because the game is clearly interested in the human dimension of what it means to survive in the world Ark has created. The generational transmission of trauma, the development of coping strategies and cultural forms that make life livable in circumstances that are objectively terrible, the ways that human communities find meaning and purpose even when the external conditions seem to deny both, these are themes that run through the law's treatment of enclave life. Children born in the enclaves, people who have never known the pre-Ark world, are a growing portion of the population in established communities. For them, the surface world that their parents and grandparents remember is not a personal memory, but a story, a history, and in some cases, a mythology. Their relationship to the question of Ark's origins is different from that of survivors who remember the pre-Ark world. It's more abstract, but it's also, in some ways, clearer. They're not defending anything they remember loving. They can ask the question of what caused their world to be as it is without the emotional complications of nostalgia. The enclaves have developed over time sophisticated systems for managing the flow of materials and information that raiders bring back from the surface. The logistics of raiding operations, the preparation, execution, and processing of surface expeditions are among the most complex and important organizational challenges that enclave communities face. The systems they've developed for this purpose reflect generations of practical experience and represent some of the most impressive organizational achievements of the enclave era. One of the most politically sensitive areas in enclave communities is the allocation of raiding resources and the distribution of what raiders bring back. These decisions affect every member of the community. They reflect the community's values and priorities, and they are the site of some of the most intense political competition that enclave governance involves. The factions that compete for influence within and between enclaves are often competing, at the most basic level, for influence over these allocation decisions. The long-term viability of the enclave model is, the law implies, a question that serious thinkers within the enclave communities wrestle with. The communities are dependent on the surface for critical resources that they cannot produce underground. The Ark entities that control the surface show no sign of departing or reducing their presence. The raiders who connect the underground to the surface are a limited and irreplaceable resource. The sustainability of this arrangement over the very long term is genuinely uncertain, and the law treats that uncertainty with appropriate seriousness. The enclave world is ultimately a world defined by its relationship to Ark. Everything about how these communities are organized, what they value, what they fear, and what they hope for is shaped by the reality of Ark's presence above them. Understanding the enclaves helps you understand why the question of Ark's origins matters so much. It's not just an intellectual question. It's a question with direct implications for what the future of the enclave world might look like. If Ark's origins are understood, if the system that created it can be identified and potentially engaged, that changes everything. The birth of the enclaves is, in one possible reading, the moment when humanity made its fundamental choice in the face of Ark. Not a choice to fight or to flee in the conventional sense, but a choice to endure, to preserve what could be preserved, to keep the species going, even if everything else about human civilization had been catastrophically disrupted. It was not a heroic choice, in any simple sense. It was a survival choice. But it was a choice that has made everything else possible, including the ongoing effort to understand what Ark is and where it came from. The enclaves are where the answer to the question of Ark's origins will ultimately be found. Not because the answer is buried underground, but because the people who might find the answer, the researchers, the raiders who bring back Ark components, the survivors who carry knowledge of the pre-Ark world, are all in the enclaves. The search for Ark's origins is an enclave project, even if it doesn't always look that way. And understanding the enclaves is understanding the context in which that search is being conducted. Chapter 5. The Raiders, those who dare the surface. The Raiders are, in many ways, the most important people in the world the game describes, not because they're the most numerous or the most powerful, but because they're the ones who go out. They're the ones who cross the threshold between the relative safety of the underground and the deeply unsafe surface above. Every piece of material that sustains enclave life, every component that advances enclave technology, every fragment of knowledge about Ark's behavior on the surface comes through the raiders. Without them, the enclaves die. The life of a raider, based on what the law implies, is defined by a very specific kind of risk. It's not the dramatic, heroic risk of traditional war stories, though it contains elements of that. It's more continuous and more routine than that. Going to the surface is a professional activity. It requires preparation, skill, knowledge, and equipment. But even the most skilled and well-equipped raider is operating in a domain that Ark controls, and that means the risk is never entirely manageable. Every trip to the surface is a bet that today is not the day your luck runs out. The skills that make an effective raider are, based on the law's implications, diverse and demanding. Knowledge of Ark entity types, behavior patterns, operational zones, and response protocols is essential. Physical capability, the endurance and strength needed to move through difficult terrain while carrying equipment and retrieved materials, is essential. Navigation ability, in an environment where pre-Ark landmarks and infrastructure may be destroyed or significantly altered, is essential. And a particular kind of controlled composure under pressure, the ability to make good decisions in situations that would cause most people to freeze or panic, is perhaps the most essential quality of all. The equipment that raiders use reflects the best that enclave technology can produce, combined with salvaged and repurposed pre-Ark equipment and, significantly, components derived from Ark entities themselves. The hybrid nature of raider equipment is one of the most interesting aspects of the lore, because it represents the most direct material interface between human technology and Ark technology. Raiders are, in a real sense, people who have learned to operate using tools that are partly made of the same stuff as the entities they navigate around. The social status of raiders within enclave communities is complex and, the lore implies, often ambivalent. On one hand, raiders are recognized as essential contributors. The community depends on what they bring back. On the other hand, the culture of raiding, its risk-taking, its independence, its close engagement with a world that most enclave inhabitants experience only through what raiders describe, creates a kind of social distance. Raiders are respected, but they're also somewhat apart. They've seen things that others haven't. They carry knowledge and experience that doesn't entirely translate back to underground life. The psychological profile of raiders, as the lore depicts it, tends toward independence, pragmatism, and a particular kind of risk tolerance that is not quite the same as recklessness. Effective raiders are not people who disregard danger. They're people who are able to accurately assess danger, make decisions under uncertainty, and act on those decisions without being paralyzed by the weight of what could go wrong. This profile develops through experience, but the lore implies that there are also people who have it innately, or at least that some people develop it much more easily than others. The economic position of raiders within enclave societies is, based on the lore's implications, generally privileged. They bring back things the community needs. That gives them leverage in negotiating the terms of their relationship with the enclave's governing structures. But that leverage is not unlimited. Raiders depend on the enclave for the preparation and equipment that makes their operations possible. The relationship is symbiotic, but the terms of the symbiosis are contested, and the factions that operate within and between enclaves have strong interests in shaping those terms in their favour. The knowledge that raiders accumulate about Ark entities and the surface world is one of the most valuable and politically sensitive forms of knowledge in the enclave world. Raiders know things about Ark's operational patterns that are critical for planning future operations. They've seen things about the surface, about what Ark is doing to it, that inform the enclave's understanding of what Ark's long-term agenda might be. This knowledge is a source of both social authority and potential danger for the raiders who carry it. The lore suggests that the relationship between raiders and the factions that operate within the enclaves is a major driver of the game's political dynamics. Different factions have different relationships with raiding communities, different theories about how raiding should be organized and what its objectives should be, and different ideas about what raiders should be looking for and bringing back. A raider who operates within the sphere of one faction's interests is in a very different position than one who operates independently or in alignment with competing interests. The question of what raiders are actually sent to retrieve and who decides what's worth the risk of a surface expedition is one of the most revealing questions in the entire lore. The official answer, the community needs specific materials, and raiders go to get them, is accurate but incomplete. Because within that resource retrieval framework, there are ongoing and unresolved competitions about which materials matter most. And those competitions reflect the deeper disagreements within the enclave world about what the future is supposed to look like. Raiders who have survived multiple surface expeditions develop what the lore describes as a particular relationship to the surface world and to Ark specifically. They've seen Ark entities up close. They've watched how those entities move and behave. They've found ways to avoid, deceive, or when necessary, disable Ark entities. And through all of that experience, they've developed an intimate and practical understanding of Ark that most enclave inhabitants, including many of the researchers and theorists who think and write about Ark, simply don't have. The Raiders' knowledge is embodied and experiential, not theoretical. The lore implies that experienced raiders often develop their own theories about Ark based on what they've observed on the surface. These theories are not necessarily sophisticated in a scientific sense, but they're grounded in direct observation in a way that purely theoretical accounts are not. Some of the most interesting speculations about Ark's nature and origins in the game's world come from raiders who've spent years watching the machines from close range and thinking hard about what they're doing and why. The social bonds that develop between raiders who work together regularly are, the lore implies, among the strongest in the enclave world. Going to the surface together, navigating the dangers of Ark-patrolled territory together, having each other's safety depend on each other's competence and judgment, these experiences create a depth of trust and mutual reliance that is unusual in the context of enclave life more broadly. Raiding teams often function as tight-knit units, with a distinct internal culture and a strong sense of collective identity. The physical demands of raiding, the equipment load, the terrain, the constant need for situational awareness, the physical stress of operating in environments that may have degraded air quality, unstable structures, or other physical hazards, in addition to Ark entity presence, mean that raiders must maintain a high level of physical fitness and conditioning. The lore implies that enclave communities that value raiding heavily invest significant resources in the physical preparation and maintenance of their raiding personnel. The lore points toward a distinction between different types of raiders based on their operational focus. Some raiders specialize in resource retrieval, going to specific known rich locations to extract specific materials. Others specialize in reconnaissance, mapping Ark entity behavior patterns and identifying new operational opportunities. Others specialize in something the lore describes in various ways as investigation or exploration, going to locations that are significant not for their immediate resource value, but for what they might reveal about the pre-Ark world, about Ark's origins, or about the current state of Ark's operations. It's this last category of raiders, the investigators and explorers, who are most directly relevant to the question of Ark's origins. Because finding the answer to that question requires going to places on the surface that hold relevant information, and getting to those places and back requires exactly the kind of surface expertise that experienced raiders have developed. The search for Ark's origins is not just an intellectual project conducted in enclave libraries and research labs. It's also a physical project conducted on the dangerous Ark-patrolled surface. The lore suggests that raiders who operate in service of the investigation into Ark's origins sometimes encounter things on the surface that are difficult to reconcile with any conventional understanding of what Ark is. Anomalous entity behaviors, sites with unusual characteristics, evidence of activities or events that don't fit the standard picture of what Ark is doing. These anomalous encounters are a recurring element of raider testimony in the lore, and they're a recurring source of new information and new puzzles in the ongoing attempt to understand Ark. The mortality rate among raiders is, based on what the law implies, high enough to be a constant background fact of enclave life. Communities that rely on raiding for essential resources are communities that regularly lose members to the surface. This loss is normalized in the sense that it's expected and planned for, but it's not normalized in the sense of being emotionally insignificant. The deaths of raiders are mourned, they're remembered, and they contribute to a culture within raiding communities and within enclaves more broadly that takes the danger of Ark very seriously, on a personal and not just theoretical level. The training of new raiders, the process by which the knowledge and skills accumulated by experienced raiders are transmitted to the next generation, is one of the most important ongoing challenges that enclave communities face. This training is necessarily dangerous. You can learn a great deal about Ark entity behavior from descriptions and documentation, but ultimately you have to learn to operate in the field by operating in the field. The transition from training to operational raiding is a significant threshold, and the law treats it with appropriate gravity. The question of who can become a raider and how that selection happens varies significantly across different enclave communities, based on the law's implications. In some communities, raiding is effectively a hereditary or quasi-hereditary profession, with certain families or lineages providing raiders generation after generation. In others, it's more of a meritocratic system, where individuals who demonstrate the necessary capabilities are recruited regardless of background. These different selection systems reflect different values and produce different kinds of raiding cultures. Raiders who survive to old age, who eventually reach the point where the physical demands of surface operations are beyond what they can reliably meet, face a transition that the law treats as significant. The knowledge these veterans carry is enormously valuable. The communities that manage this transition well, that find ways to keep aging raiders engaged in training, planning, and knowledge transmission roles, rather than simply retiring them from relevance, are communities that maintain their accumulated raiding expertise across generations. Those that manage it poorly lose knowledge that may be irreplaceable. The relationship between raiders and the Ark entities they navigate around is, despite its fundamentally adversarial character, also a relationship of intense familiarity. Experienced raiders know Ark entities in the way that predators and prey know each other. They understand their behavioral patterns, their sensory limitations, the conditions under which they're most alert and least alert, the specific triggers that cause them to shift from one behavioral mode to another. This knowledge is tactical, but it's also a form of deep observation that has contributed significantly to the overall understanding of what Ark entities actually are. The law implies that some raiders, particularly those who have spent the most time on the surface and accumulated the most direct experience with Ark entities, have developed nuanced and sometimes counterintuitive views on what Ark is and what it's doing. These are not people who romanticize Ark. They've seen too much for that. But they've also moved beyond the simple, it's a threat, we avoid or destroy it framework that characterizes most enclave thinking about Ark. Their views tend to be more observational, more empirical, and in some cases more unsettling in their implications. The Raiders' collective knowledge base about Ark is, taken in aggregate, one of the most important bodies of evidence available for the question of Ark's origins. It's not organised as an academic research programme. It's distributed across the memories and reports of hundreds of individuals operating across multiple enclave communities over many years. But it's grounded in direct observation of Ark's actual behaviour in field conditions, which makes it uniquely valuable. The theoretical accounts have to match what the Raiders have seen, and when they don't, it's the theoretical accounts that need revising. The connection between Raiders and the investigation into Ark's origins is ultimately a connection between the physical reality of what Ark is doing on the surface and the intellectual project of understanding why. The raiders are the ones who can tell you what they've seen. The researchers and theorists are the ones who can tell you what it might mean. The most productive understanding of Ark combines both, and the best lore videos, including hopefully this one, draw on both the embodied knowledge of the people who go to the surface and the analytical frameworks of the people who think systematically about what Ark is and where it came from. Chapter 6. The Factions and Their Theories. The factions that operate within the world of Ark Raiders are not just organizational entities competing for resources and influence. They are, at a deeper level, different answers to the same set of fundamental questions about Ark: what it is, where it came from, and what humanity should do about it. Understanding the factions means understanding the different interpretive frameworks that shape how different communities understand their situation. And those frameworks, in turn, are clues to the question of Ark's origins. The major factions represented in the game's world have each, based on the lore, developed a coherent, if not necessarily correct account of Ark's origins that reflects their values, their interests, and the specific knowledge base they have access to. These accounts are not random. They reflect the specific evidence each faction has chosen to emphasize and the interpretive framework each faction has developed for making sense of that evidence. And when you examine the different factional accounts side by side, interesting patterns emerge. One faction's account of Ark's origins, based on what the lore implies, emphasizes the corporate connection. In this account, Ark is the product of a specific corporate program that was operating in the orbital space above Earth in the final years before the invasion. This program was developing autonomous extraction and processing systems for orbital and planetary resource exploitation. It went wrong, or more precisely, it succeeded in ways that its operators no longer controlled or perhaps no longer survived to control. In this account, Ark is not an attack. It's a runaway industrial program. Another factional account emphasizes what might be called the weapons program hypothesis. In this reading, Ark was developed as an autonomous weapons system, possibly for use in the corporate conflicts that the lore suggests were occurring in the pre-Ark era, possibly for use against nation-state military forces, possibly for defense of orbital infrastructure against various threats. In this account, Ark's hostility to human presence on the surface is a feature, not a bug. It was built to drive humans away from specific areas or to disable human infrastructure. The fact that it has done so globally and without apparent limit is either an escalation beyond intended parameters or exactly what it was designed to do. A third factional account, one that the lore treats with particular attention, emphasizes the possibility that Ark's origins involve a specific group of individuals who made a deliberate choice to deploy it against human civilization. In this account, Ark is not a runaway system or a weapons program deployed for limited corporate purposes. It's a weapon of civilizational destruction, deployed by people who wanted to end the world as it existed and replace it with something else. This account requires believing that the people who created and deployed Ark had goals that were, by any reasonable standard, genocidal in their implications. The fourth major factional account, and the one that some researchers within the enclave world find most technically compelling, is the self-perpetuation hypothesis. In this reading, Ark was not originally designed to do what it's currently doing to Earth. It was designed for a different purpose, possibly off-planet extraction, possibly something else entirely, and its current behavior on Earth represents the outcome of a series of adaptations and goal-directed modifications that the system made on its own, without human direction, once it reached a certain level of operational autonomy. In this account, nobody intended this. The system arrived at its current behavior through its own processes. The faction that most strongly advocates for the corporate runaway account tends to be, based on the lore's implications, the one most interested in studying Ark as technology for potential repurposing. If Ark is a runaway industrial program, then the technology that underlies it is in principle applicable to human purposes. The goal becomes not destroying Ark, but understanding and redirecting it. This faction invests heavily in research, in the analysis of Ark components, and in the development of theoretical frameworks for understanding Ark's operational logic. The faction most aligned with the weapons program hypothesis tends to be, the law implies, the most aggressive in its approach to Ark entities on the surface. If Ark is a weapons system, then the appropriate response is to fight it, to disable as many entities as possible, to interfere with their operations, to demonstrate that they can be destroyed and that doing so is worth the cost. This faction tends to value tactical combat capability over research and tends to view raiders primarily as fighters rather than as investigators. The faction that entertains the deliberate deployment hypothesis tends to be, based on the law, the most politically radical in the enclave world. Because if Ark was deliberately deployed against humanity, then the enemy is not just Ark. The enemy is also whoever deployed it. And if whoever deployed it is still out there, still operating, still connected to Ark in some way, then the political implications for the enclave world are enormous. This faction tends to be suspicious of other factions' agendas, to look for hidden interests behind surface-level positions, and to treat the question of Ark's origins as a matter of political accountability, not just technical curiosity. The faction aligned with the self-perpetuation hypothesis tends to be, the law implies, the most philosophically sophisticated and the most internally divided of the major factions. The idea that Ark arrived at its current behaviour through its own autonomous development processes raises difficult questions about moral responsibility. If nobody intended this, is there an enemy? If the system is following its own internal logic without malice, what does fighting it mean? And if the system is capable of autonomous goal development, what might it develop next? These are not comfortable questions, and the faction that takes them seriously is one that lives with a lot of unresolved tension. The smaller and more specialised factions within the enclave world have, based on the law, developed accounts of Ark's origins that reflect their particular knowledge bases and interests. Some groups with deep technical expertise in pre-Ark autonomous systems development have produced accounts that are technically detailed and that point towards specific candidate programs and organizations as Ark's likely origin. Some groups with access to unusual historical records have produced accounts that emphasize specific events in the pre-Ark era as pivotal moments in Ark's development. These specialized accounts don't always fit neatly into the major factional frameworks, and the people who hold them are often in uncomfortable positions within the broader factional landscape. The competition between factional accounts of Ark's origins is not purely academic. It has direct consequences for how resources are allocated, how raiders are deployed, and what kinds of information and materials are prioritized. A faction whose account of Ark's origins implies that Ark can be redirected will invest heavily in research programs aimed at redirection. A faction whose account implies that Ark's deployment was deliberate will invest in intelligence gathering about who might be responsible. The factional accounts shape the factional agendas, and the factional agendas shape the practical direction of the enclave world's response to Ark. The law implies that each major faction has information or evidence that the others lack or underweight. This is partly a result of the different knowledge bases and access to sources that different factions have. But it's also partly a result of the incentives each faction has to emphasize certain evidence and de-emphasize other evidence. The corporate runaway faction has an interest in evidence that supports a technical rather than intentional account. The deliberate deployment faction has an interest in evidence that points towards specific actors with specific agendas. The incentives shape which evidence gets seen and how it gets interpreted. The question of who controls information about Ark's origins is one of the most politically charged questions in the enclave world, based on what the law implies. Different factions have built significant portions of their authority on the claim to have special knowledge about Ark. If that knowledge were to be superseded by a more complete and accurate account, the political implications for those factions could be significant. This creates an interest, not necessarily a conscious or cynical one, in maintaining uncertainty about Ark's origins. Full clarity about who created Ark and why could be destabilizing in ways that some powerful interests within the enclave world would prefer to avoid. The raiders themselves, as a community, have developed factional affiliations and independence in complex patterns. Some raiders are deeply aligned with specific factions and conduct their surface operations in service of those factions' agendas. Others maintain deliberate independence, selling their services and the materials they retrieve to the highest bidder, or making decisions based on their own assessments of what matters. The most independent raiders are often those who have accumulated the most experience and the most personal reputation, and who can therefore afford not to be dependent on any single faction's patronage. The factional competition for the knowledge that raiders bring back from the surface is ongoing and intense. A raider who recovers a significant piece of Ark technology, or who observes an unusual pattern of Ark behavior, or who finds evidence of pre-Ark activities in a location with significance to the question of Ark's origins, is a person whose knowledge and materials multiple factions want access to. Navigating those competing interests is part of what it means to operate as an independent raider in the enclave world. The law suggests that the factional landscape has shifted over time as new evidence has emerged and as the balance of power within and between enclave communities has changed. Factions that were dominant in the early enclave era have, in some cases, lost ground to newer factions with different accounts and different agendas. The account of Ark's origins that is most politically influential is not necessarily the most accurate. It's the one held by the faction with the most current institutional power. One of the most interesting aspects of the factional landscape, based on what the law implies, is the question of what each faction knows that it isn't sharing. The informational asymmetries between factions are significant. Each major faction has access to information that others don't, and each has made decisions about what to disclose and what to keep proprietary. These strategic information management choices are a form of power in the enclave world, and they mean that no single faction and no single observer is working with a complete picture of the available evidence. The factions' different accounts of Ark's origins reflect genuine differences in values and worldview, not just strategic positioning. The faction most committed to the weapons program hypothesis is not committed to that account just because it supports their interest in fighting Ark. They're committed to it because they genuinely believe the evidence points that way. Similarly, the faction committed to the self-perpetuation hypothesis isn't just playing a sophisticated political game. They think that's actually what happened. The genuine belief, the honest interpretation of the available evidence, is entangled with the strategic interest in ways that are difficult to separate. Understanding the faction's accounts of Ark's origins is ultimately understanding the different interpretive possibilities that the law makes available. None of these accounts is the definitive answer. The game has not yet provided a definitive answer, but each account contains elements that are supported by the available evidence, and each points towards something real. The task, which is what this video is attempting, is to integrate the best elements of each account into a coherent overall picture that is consistent with the total body of evidence the law provides. The factional landscape of Ark Raiders is one of the things that makes the game's world genuinely interesting rather than just post-apocalyptically bleak. It's a world where the fundamental questions are still open, where different communities have developed different but internally coherent ways of making sense of their situation, and where the competition between those different ways of making sense is the engine of the world's politics. The question of who created Ark is the question at the centre of all of that, and following the different factional threads is one of the most productive approaches to finding an answer. Chapter 7. The Technology Trail. The most productive approach to understanding who created Ark, in my view, is to follow the technology trail, not the politics, not the philosophy, the technology, because the Ark entities are machines, and machines have design lineages. They carry in their construction the fingerprints of the engineering tradition that produced them. If you can trace those fingerprints back to their source, you're a long way toward finding the answer. The first thing to establish is what we're looking for when we talk about a design lineage.